Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs. In this episode, we'll discuss the 24th Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Lectionary 32 or Proper 27, which falls on November 7th this year. One content notification for this episode, we do talk about supersessionism, which is a type of antisemitism, and the concept of an abusive God when we discuss the deep dive.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
For our deep dive today, we are deep diving into perspectives and morality. Our passages, especially our 1 Kings and our Gospel reading, both raise the question, whose perspective are we looking at this from? And that then implies questions about what is morality? Is it moral? Is it not moral? And I think there's a lot of times in our culture, and this has happened a fair amount lately, where people will say, well, that's your perspective, and my perspective is different. And there is a certain extent to which our perspective matters, and the moral conclusions we come to might be different based on our perspective. But there are also a lot of situations where, no, some things are actually just wrong or just harmful. And we each kind of create our own reasoning behind that. I think it's probably safe to say that both Kay and I tend towards if it is harming a person or a creature or the earth, there are concerns.
Yeah.
If it is not, then maybe it's a perspective thing.
There was a recent post in a Reddit that is about, am I being the jerk in this situation?
Oh, kind of thing. AITA.
Yes, where this guy had this incredibly ugly pair of pants, and he loved these pants. They were super comfortable. They're his favorite. He posted a picture. I don't have a lot of aesthetic sense, but wow, they were impressively ugly. And like everyone agreed that yes, those are ugly. And then the ongoing conversation was, does his girlfriend get to tell him under certain circumstances he's not allowed to wear them to things? And that got more complicated. But that was interesting because I don't actually run across a piece of clothing where everyone agrees that yes, it's ugly. And yet the Reddit and also the people on Twitter discussing it later, which is where I ran into it, were pretty much agreed that, okay, yes, they are ugly. That is a crime against fashion. But also they're your pants and you like them. And therefore, yes, of course you're allowed to wear them. Although, if you really don't want to piss off your girlfriend, maybe pay attention to where you're wearing them too. But that's entirely your decision. So
that's fantastic. And a reminder that crimes against fashion are in fact not illegal.
Yes, and sometimes really fun.
Yeah.
So, and apparently in some cases really comfortable. So good for him.
I am apparently really great at that. My best friend and I used to joke about, like, because neither of us have any fashion sense, so it would be like, oh, that's blue and that's blue, so they match. That has
I'm
plaid,
pretty sure
and
that's
that
not
has
supposed
plaid,
to be how it works.
so they match.
However, not all questions of perspectives and morality are quite that lighthearted. We have two readings today that definitely bring this into perspective, you might say. Although, I don't know, I'm trying to figure out if our reading from Hebrews can do that too. And to be honest, it's just yet more of Hebrews talking about Jesus as the high priest. And Emily and I have both agreed that we're pretty much done with Hebrews. Yeah. But
I think I could.
It's been the same thing for 6 weeks.
I'll try and figure it out.
But the first reading is from 1 Kings, and there is this drought going on. And what you don't get in this particular reading is that the drought is going on in part because of both God and Elijah. The king at the time was Ahab. He had married Jezebel. He and Jezebel were worshiping Baal and treating people terribly and being miserly, I guess, and like a bunch of other stuff, just being wildly unjust and rude. Mm-hmm. And so because of this, God gets angry. And God tells Elijah that God is angry, and Elijah declares that there's going to be a drought. And then lo and behold, there is a drought, mysteriously. No idea how that happened.
Weird.
And then God tells Elijah, go visit this widow. I have told her to look after you and to feed you. And Elijah goes. And the thing is that the conversation that Elijah and the widow have when he arrives, it's not entirely clear on whether she knows that God has said that she's going to feed Elijah. Like,
Yeah.
she's being polite to him, but there's no acknowledgement that, oh, yes, you're the visitor that the messenger of the Lord said was going to show up yesterday. Gee, that was scary.
So many eyes.
Yeah, there is no conversation like that. She agrees to feed him, but there's no acknowledgement that there's that relationship there. And so, like, does she know? Did God like forget to send that email?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. And Elijah provides her and her son with unlimited food. Well, limited in the sense that it doesn't change much. It sounds pretty boring, but they do eat and they are not
Mm-hmm.
hungry,
More on
and
that later.
that part is great.
Hashtag Lord of the
Yes,
Rings.
but the thing is, where does this fall in the case of morality? Like,
Mm.
this drought would have affected a lot of people. Now, as far as I can tell, reading the spaces just outside this passage, I don't think anyone was specifically said to have died from this
Mm-hmm.
drought. It probably reduced the king's treasury by a certain amount, and that may not have been something that, made anyone angry aside from Ahab himself. And it would have made it clear to Ahab and Jezebel that God is the one in control, or at least I'm assuming this was the overall point.
Mm-hmm.
But only one person dies during the course of this drought that we know of. It's the widow's son. Elijah brings him back to life. That works out, in the end.
Right, but also there's that perspective of like letting someone
Yeah.
die, even if they're
Well,
going to be
and
brought
we're
back to
not
life.
clear on whether he would have
Mm-hmm.
died anyway,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, like, I don't think the cause is made super clear.
Mm.
But so yeah, this whole thing of, is it ethical to cause a drought in order to wake up a evil king and queen and get them to realize that God is more important than they are? And that's kind of left ambiguously.
Mm-hmm.
Come to think of it, I would really love to talk to someone who knows something about the Talmud and what that says about these passages, because that would be super interesting. But
Yeah. And part of it, right, is
Mishnah.
that based on what the widow says, the drought impacts the widow and therefore impacts poorer people most severely. Like, yes, the
Right.
king's treasury might decrease some, and that's, annoying for the king and not so annoying for everybody else. But whenever there's droughts, whenever there's famines, think about like climate change right now. And the ones who are doing the most harm are giant corporations. And the ones that are most impacted are people in situations of poverty where they can't escape necessarily if a giant hurricane is coming, or if there's heat waves or droughts that wipe out the crops that give them the space of sustainability.
Sure.
And so that tie in there is important.
Well, and we don't know so much, though, is the thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for all we know, this widow and her son are the only ones that actually would have starved to death during the drought, and that's why God sent Elijah to them.
Right. That's
So
what I'd like to believe.
there's no way to tell. Yeah, in a perfect world.
Yeah.
But
So when we get to the Hebrews, yes, I know I'm stretching a little bit, but I think it actually works. It's one of the things that we've noticed throughout this series on Hebrews is, so the way that Hebrews categorizes Jesus is as the high priest to replace the high priests that were a part of Judaism, which is complicated to say the least.
yeah.
As Christians, it's important for us to recognize when something is supersessionist and to name that. And this is really one of the stronger supersessionist letters. And so supersessionism is Christianity replaces Judaism. So when people talk about like, oh, the Old Testament God, it's terrible, but the New Testament God is better, that's supersessionism. It's very anti-Semitic. That particular example is also super inaccurate.
Yes. Most anti-Semitism is.
Right.
Just gonna throw that out there. But yeah.
So when we are looking at the book of Hebrews, that is a place where if you're looking at it from a perspective that is not aware of Judaism or anti-Semitic tropes or the impact of supersessionism on Jewish people and the Jewish faith, you're not going to understand the full consequences and the full impact of those things on Jewish people. So part of it is not just like, whose perspective are you looking from for if it's moral or not, but also like, are you aware of the perspective of someone who is marginalized or oppressed and how this impacts them? That's the particular perspective that frequently will shift any sort of moral claims that we might have about an event or a book of the Bible.
Yeah. And just to throw in there also, God's promises to the Jewish people have not changed or run out or stopped. All of God's promises to the Jewish people are still running, and their relationship with God has not changed, and they are still God's chosen people, and that's fine.
Yep.
So
yeah, we don't dispute that ever, and
we have a different kind of relationship with God is the way we usually phrase it.
Yes. And we'll get into that more also a little bit next week in our deep dive as we talk about the different books of the Bible and what their purposes are and what kind of books they are.
Sure.
The other piece, though, in Hebrews is this concept of sacrifice, right? And so I think when Pace was on for a Reformation episode, they said this, or they might have said this to me separately, but the idea that like suffering is at all redemptive is terrible, right? Like that it shouldn't be needed. We shouldn't need suffering to redeem something. Suffering shouldn't be an act of redemption. And Hebrews is all about not only Jesus as the high priest, but Jesus as the high priest who sacrifices himself willingly for the sake of others, for the sake of the many. And that's one of the ones that I think is my favorite, like, counterpoint to the God of the Old Testament is mean, is okay, but the God of the New Testament is an abusive parent because they send their kid to die, to suffer and die for people.
Although Jesus is also God, so that gets confusing, and possibly God just needs therapy.
I mean, God definitely seems to need therapy.
Or maybe just another nap. Like, maybe it's been so long since that first seventh day, and God hasn't rested, and, like, really, come on, people.
This is true. I think both therapy and a nap might be perfect for God. Maybe something to eat.
Yeah.
But that's, right, there are a lot of ways, and we're not getting into atonement theories today, because that would be its own whole other deep dive.
Yeah, no, I'm quite literally not getting paid enough for that, sorry.
Yeah. Literally not getting paid at all.
Exactly.
I mean, we could get paid.
I would at least need baked goods, I'm just saying.
That's true, yeah. We'll make baked goods sometime when we actually do atonement theories. But, so all of that to say, to talk about and to understand one person sacrificing themselves for the sake of many is a morality and a perspective thing. It is a question of agency and willingness. It is a question of necessity. Does one person actually need to die? Does anyone actually need to die? And those are questions that we are certainly not going to answer on this deep dive, but are questions that keep coming up. And we've asked them before on this podcast, and we'll keep asking them. And we would love for you, our dear listeners, to share your thoughts on the answers to those questions or other questions that you have that bring up questions of morality in the Bible.
And so often questions of morality in the Bible or anywhere change so much when you recognize that God is one of the characters in the story. Like God being, omnipotent and super powerful and all that. God existing changes the morality of a lot of things, because then why would that widow need to starve? Why would Jesus have to sacrifice himself if God could just snap God's fingers, Jesus or not, and deal with it all, etc. And so speaking of that, and God being a character in the story, our gospel reading is of Jesus and the poor widow who donates her last 2 pennies to the treasury. It's a little unclear,
temple, right?
Yeah, I believe it's the temple's treasury, but it's a little unclear, did people line up on a, say, weekly basis to donate to the temple's treasury, or is this like a special day, or
is it just
we're not clear
while you're walking,
or was there a particular need?
Yeah,
we don't know. But basically, and this story is often called the widow's mite, which is just an older term for it.
How do you spell mite?
M-I-T-E.
Just making sure. Otherwise, the widow's might,
Sure.
which I think it like works as like the widow's like strength and power.
MIGHT. Yes. Well, and it takes a certain amount of strength and power to put your last 2 pennies into the plate,
Yeah.
right? And so the thing is that Jesus is sitting there. Jesus watches this widow literally bankrupt herself, apparently, and knows that that's happening. And then she presumably walks off out of his life and he never sees her again. Like,
Mm-hmm.
he doesn't make sure that she's going to be okay. The disciples don't like offer to, help her. That seems odd. Or does she receive help from the temple? We don't like that. Would be actually a fairly reasonable thing for
Yeah.
the temple,
Right,
which
like
is
presumably that's what
all
it's
about
for.
caring for the widows and orphans and such. Yeah. In which case, is she actually donating a piece of what she received already?
Mm.
We don't know. We don't exactly know what's going to happen next, or really what the backstory of this widow is. But it does, for me personally, confirm something that I've heard several times, which is that working class people are the best tippers
Mm.
because they are the ones who appreciate the work. And so if the widow had received money or gifts from the temple in order to sustain her, it would make sense to me that she would give back to it
Yeah.
in order to help others. That would not
Yeah.
surprise me.
Also, it's not just like a tipping thing, but in general, working class people or lower class people are the ones who give the most proportionally to
Yes.
their income. So when we think about like somebody once did the math and there was like some famous person who gave like what sounds like a lot of money to me or to
Sure.
Kay, but actually was like the equivalent of pocket change
Mhm.
to an organization. But they get lauded as like being such impressive, like providing so much. And the reality is like, no, they're providing out of their pocket change, which is what Jesus is critiquing, right? People who
Right.
are giving out of their abundance. Whereas people who are working class, people who are living in situations of poverty, are the ones who are most generous, right? Like, I know I and my friends have like, oh, you need money, so we'll Venmo you money, and then the next week you're going to Venmo us money, and like there's something of a circle of
The
abundance.
ancient thing of the millennials passing the same $20 bill around electronically for the last 10 years.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And there's a little bit to that is like, that's also generosity and giving that is not recognized. It's rarely recognized by the church. It's not recognized as giving in terms of like taxes. But the church also like does a disservice to people when we don't realize and recognize that mutual aid, like concepts of mutual aid, are so important and are so vital, and they've blossomed during the pandemic because people have needed it so much. But if we're not supporting that and acknowledging that, then we're, repeating the thing of the rich people who are coming to the temple and will like give a few pennies out of their pocket change, basically,
Right.
while others are giving so very sacrificially to the extent that that widow might not eat tonight.
Yeah.
Also, tipping in and of itself is like, the institution of tipping comes from slavery, so that's complicated. But if you want to protest tipping itself, you should talk to managers and talk to the store owners and tell them that they need to pay a living wage, not just not tip. You should always tip. That is how people make enough money. Tipping wages are like, the minimum wage for tipping is way lower than the minimum wage for any other job. So keep tipping if there's like an option for tipping. Church people are actually usually the worst at tipping.
Yes. The Sunday lunch crowd is known as the shift no one wants to work in restaurants.
Yeah. And just to be clear, tithing 10% to God is not tipping God. Tipping 10% to a worker is not tithing and is way too low of a tip in the United States of America. Yes. Just to be perfectly clear for you, folks. That's a soapbox I will hop on any day. So keep tipping. So part of when we were first talking about doing this deep dive, the immediate thing that came to mind for me was a class I took in college. It was a January term class, so one class for a month, and it was called Vocation of Religious Education. And surprising, no like clergy people. It was partially funded by the Lilly Foundation, hence the word vocation in the title. But the basics of it, as the professor said, was to teach the Bible in such a way that when people got to Luther College, which is where I went for undergrad, and took the Intro to the Bible courses, they would not have a faith crisis, because the Intro to the Bible courses were historical criticism. And a lot of folks who had never looked at the Bible historically would come and be like, and it would rock their worlds. And some people have the ability to keep going from that, and some people don't. So,
right. And sometimes that changes.
Yeah. And some people back out and double down on what they've learned before. But one of the things that we did was we shared our favorite Bible stories. And when we would say, we wrote them on the board, I think. And so one person had said Noah, and Professor Swanson then was going through them after we had all written them on the board, and was like, the story of Noah. God wipes out all of humanity save one family.
Maybe the person just really liked boats.
Right? But that's not how anybody has ever taught me Noah. Noah is about cute animals on a ship. That is what it's about. But the reality...
People are allowed to like boats, Emily.
Yes. People are allowed to like boats. And also, that's not what the story is about.
No, probably not.
But that was one of the things that first hit me, of both in terms of, as you were saying, Kay, God is a character in the story.
Yes.
And whose perspective are we reading the story from, right? What would it look like if we read the story of Noah from the perspective of Noah's next door neighbor? Especially if Noah's next door neighbor's wife, because there's some amount of agency where adult men are invited to hop on and join in the fun, but the women don't have as much agency in that. And so
or indeed free time.
So they might not be able to decide, I want to live.
Yeah.
So I think it'll be interesting as we continue in this podcast to occasionally have those questions of whose perspective are we looking at here? Right? Because what's the perspective of the widow? If the widow of Zarephath, I'm about to die, and this jerk, right? This would be Elijah is a great person to do the "Am I the jerk?" AITA. Right? This guy comes up and is like, "Give me water." In a drought of all things, he wants water, and then he wants food, right?
Yeah.
Versus Elijah's perspective, which is, I will ask you these things, and God has told you to give them to me, and you will be okay.
Yeah. So speaking of that reading, our first reading is from 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 8 through 16. The prophet Elijah meets a poor yet generous widow at Zarephath during a drought God sends to punish the king. God saves her son, and Elijah from starving to death by a miracle provided through jugs of meal and oil.
So one of the themes in this passage is the idea of sacrificial giving. So this woman who has just barely enough for, literally, she says, one last meal before they die, gives of that last meal to Elijah.
Yeah.
She gives it. It is what we call sacrificial giving. It is not something that necessarily we expect people to do ever. I think there are people who do sacrificially give, but that's not a common way we talk about giving or we talk about stewardship. And we'll at some point really dig into stewardship because I love talking about money. But the example that I thought of, because a lot of times, when we think of sacrificial giving, the automatic assumption is putting yourself in harm's way for someone else. And that's not quite what we're talking about. And so I was thinking,
I would maybe compare sacrificial giving to miracles in that those are both things that you shouldn't depend on. Those are both things that you can't necessarily count on, and yet they do happen.
Yeah, that's really great perspective for it. So the thing that I was thinking of for that was Laia in the Ember in the Ashes series has this silver armband that she received from her mother, and it's really important to her, and there's a whole bunch of other meaning to it that she's not even aware of, but it's really important to her, and it's really hard. She holds on to it, and it provides comfort for her. She never through the course of our life to the extent that, or her life to the extent that we know it, she has not given it away to anybody. she at one point allows Elias to touch it, to like hold it briefly, and then he gives it back. And then she gives it to Keenan, who turns out to be the Nightbringer, and it's this whole big like scandal betrayal thing. But that, I think, is such a good example of sacrificial giving, that it is this thing that is the last connection she has to her mom. It is something that provides her with deep comfort. It's the only possession that she actually has. And so when she gives it, it is a sacrificial giving. She doesn't know that the person who's taking it is like trying to get it for another purpose, and it's all complicated, but it is like,
Sure.
It's this beautiful like sacrificial giving, as long as you don't think about like what happens with that sacrificial gift and how it's used to harm people. But
the giving of the gift was not
correct
the problem.
Correct.
Yeah. In verse 9, we read, "Go now to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and live there, for I have commanded a widow there to feed you." Now, God is the one speaking in this line, and since God is the one who says this, we might assume it to be true. But again, as I said earlier, from what the widow actually says, we don't have any proof that she knows about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering, couldn't there be more than one widow in Zarephath? Like, did Elijah stop by the wrong house? We don't know. Elijah apparently didn't check. I get that, not 100% of all conversations are included in the Bible, but that seems like an important question to ask. Did you receive any angelic messengers recently?
Yeah.
And this reminded me of a story that is told in the 4th book of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy trilogy by Douglas Adams. And in this story, there is a character named Arthur, and he tells this story where he went to a train station and had what Americans might think of as a layover, like you have at the airport. He got off one train, he had to get on another train, he had a little while in between to stay at the train station, and so he got himself a cup of tea, because of course he's very British, and a packet of cookies and a newspaper to read, and he went to a table to sit down, and all of the tables were full except for one that had one empty spot. So he asked the guy sitting there if he could join him, and sat down across from this other guy. And he read his newspaper and he drank his tea, and after a minute, he opened up his packet of cookies and he took one out and ate it. And he kept reading his newspaper, and a minute later, the guy across from him, silently, without saying a word, reached over and took a cookie out of the packet and ate it.
Whoa.
And Arthur, being British, didn't know what to say to this. And so he decided that the only thing left for him was to, take another cookie out of the packet and eat it himself. And they went back and forth like that until the packet was done. And eventually, the other guy got up and went away. And at that point, Arthur stood up, took his empty cup of tea, picked up his newspaper, and underneath his newspaper, he found his packet of cookies.
Oh no.
And supposedly Douglas Adams included this story in the book because this is something that actually happened to him in real life. He did not clarify which of those people he was, but
that's fantastic.
Yeah. So it's a fun little story, and it reminded me of Elijah and the widow, because what if he went to the wrong widow and she just thought he was some schmuck who was
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, always, check. If God tells you something, check with the person God is talking about. Don't just assume.
Like, don't assume that you heard God correctly.
Right? Yeah, and so in verse 12, we read that the widow says to Elijah, "As the becoming one your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of meal in a jar and a little oil in a jug. I am now gathering a couple of sticks so that I may go home and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." Right? Nothing about this says, oh yeah, you're the one that God said was going to come. But also in this, there's this description that reminded me of in the Hunger Games, Katniss, as she's kind of reliving and recounting the time after her father had died and after the money had run out from the money she was paid, the family got because he died at work in a mining accident. And before she could sign up for extra food or any of that, they didn't have any money to buy food. And so she was like going around and looking in trash cans and stuff. And at the bakery, the baker's wife was really mean to her And then PETA, who was the son, one of the sons, was like baking the bread and accidentally burned the bread. And so his mom got really mad at him and was abusive and told him to throw it to the pigs, I think. And so he threw one piece of bread to the pigs and then threw the rest to Katniss. And so he knew he would get in trouble for having messed up the bread. And yet he was also the one who threw the bread to Katniss so that she might live. And so she always thought of PETA as the boy with the bread. But it's this like, something bad will happen, but you clearly need this. So yes, I will like show up for you in this particular way.
Yeah, I looked at the second part of that, or the end of that verse, so that I may go home and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. And the first thing that popped into my head was that meme of "then perish," usually with President Obama's face and bright red eyes. But
I don't know what.
at least that's the one I'm used to. It's a response that's often used. But I'll die if you don't do this, and then you put the "then perish" meme. In response, except it would be self-directed in this case. But it very much reminds me of the nihilist sense of humor that tends to happen in people who have gone through great amounts of trauma. Generationally speaking, in America, it's a sense of humor that is shared between, interestingly enough, the greatest generation and Generation Z.
Which one's the greatest generation? That's like
the folks who fought in World War II and also grew up during the Depression.
Oh, okay. I was gonna say that's some kind of nickname to give yourself, but
No,
yeah,
that
okay.
it was given to them by other people, is my understanding. But there are a few stories going around the internet of like great great grandma and her great great granddaughter are in the car, and the great great granddaughter says something incredibly nihilist because she's a member of Generation Z and has no hope for the future, and great great grandma just starts laughing her head off, and everyone else in the car is completely confused, and because that's the nihilist sense of humor that they both share because they've both been to that horrible, horrible place.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then when we get to verse 16, we read, "The jar of meal was not emptied, neither did the jug of oil fail, according to the word of the becoming one that God spoke by Elijah." So it's like lembas. The more you rely on it, the less you need, and the more it feeds you. Yay.
Excellent.
You know I had to talk about lembas bread in this passage.
Of course. I'm very impressed that it's only come up a few times this year instead of like every third episode.
I know. Well, so I tried to like diversify it during our Jesus Loves You series so that I wasn't saying it every time.
I appreciate that.
I'm pretty intentional about these things. And then our second reading is Hebrews chapter 9, verses 24 through 28. The author explains that Christ is the ultimate high priest who died once for all and is alive and waiting for the final day. So, as Kay said, we're pretty done with Hebrews as a podcast. It's the same thing over and over and over again. So I was having trouble coming up with something. So I asked a friend, and shout out to Pace of Horror Nerds at Church and of our Reformation Day episode fame, for that a theme for this passage is a horror film trope, right? So in like horror film series, the people who are like the good people have to kill the slasher. And they have to do it again and again and again in every movie until the movie that's like designated final chapter, which we might consider Jesus, coming in to be like, okay, it's done, right? And we're talking, in this sense, sin is the thing, right? Okay, it's actually done this time. And then there's still like an inevitable movie after the final chapter, which would be when Jesus comes back one more time to really, really, really end it, you know, because I don't know, I'm not a horror films person, as you all know, especially if you listened to our Hocus Pocus episode on Horror Nerds at Church where we were guests, but it makes sense. I was surprised at how well that fit with like sin being the killer and Jesus as the like one to save us in the horror films.
I assume that there are horror films that, you know, star Jesus, but I have not seen
Probably, yes. I mean, like,
I would have to imagine.
The Exorcist and stuff in certain ways, depending on how you're defining Jesus.
Oh, I meant like Jesus actually being the one killing zombies or something. But I would assume someone's done that. But
I wonder if any of you, our dear listeners, know let us know, because that would be fascinating. Anyway, and then in verse 24, we read, "For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made by human hands, a mere copy of the true one, but entered into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf." So a reminder that church is not, in fact, the building. In case you didn't get it from the past year and a half of ongoing pandemic, note that it is not over. The church, the sanctuary made by human hands, a mere copy of the true one. I get really annoyed when people are like, let's go to church. In Slovakia, actually, they have two different words. One word, kostol, is for the building, and zbor is for church, like the congregation. And I really love that, and I wish we were clearer about that in English. But I do love the hey, look, the sanctuary. It is not, in fact, the church. It is just a thing that we do that's trying to create space for us to gather. A copy of heaven itself, not actually heaven. Which means that you can sell the building when you need to.
Yeah.
So in verse 25, we read, "Nor was it to offer Christ's self again and again as the high priest enters the holy place year after year with blood that is not their own." And this just reminded me of Groundhog Day, the movie, which I haven't actually ever seen the whole thing of. I've just passed by it on TV.
It's fun.
Yeah, but it's also the 12 dates of Christmas, which is a similar thing where a person goes on a blind date and then wakes up the next day and it's the same day all over again for, as one can imagine, 12 times. But that doing it again and again and again because it's not quite sticking yet until it finally sticks. And then it's okay, now we can continue with time and things.
Yes, I read the last part of verse 25, as the high priest enters the holy place year after year with blood that is not his own. And I would just like to take a moment to point out that this is talking about a priest entering the sanctuary with an offering to give. They could not do complete blood transfusions in ancient Israel, at least not without some pretty severe divine providence involved. And I feel like the word some should be in that sentence there. Some blood that is not his own. It's not like they had to do complete blood transfusions before entering the holy place, because that's not how that worked. So just to be clear, we're not, ascribing ancient Israel with medical techniques that were a little beyond them.
It's almost as if the blood they're talking about is not, in fact, still in the human body, but outside the human body.
Yeah. Well, yes, in fact, I'm pretty sure the blood they're talking about was never in a human body, because they didn't do human sacrifice.
Also true.
Because human sacrifice is bad.
Also true.
So, yeah. Just, clearing that one up.
Thanks.
And then in verse 27, we read, "And just as it is appointed for mortals to die once, and after that, the judgment." Well, except, of course, for Lazarus, because he died, and then Jesus raised him again, and then presumably he died again.
Which you can check out our All Saints episode for that.
Yes. And if you go by the Wrinkle in Time sequel, Many Waters, which features Meg's younger brothers, Noah's daughter, who didn't die at all, like Elijah, she was instead taken up into heaven. So this is a mostly thing. Mostly people die once, and that's it. According to the Bible, some people die more than once, some people don't die at all. It mostly.
Yeah. I think it's when I was a kid, I think we learned that it was 7 times in the Bible that it happened.
That sounds about right. I don't have a number off the top of my head.
Me either, but it's a good number to pick if you're going to pick a number.
Sure. Especially in the Bible.
Yeah.
And then our gospel reading for today is from Mark chapter 12, verses 38 through 44. Jesus speaks out against the boastful and oppressive ways of the scribes and religious leaders, and praises the generosity of a poor widow who donates all she has.
So one of the themes in this passage is the calling out of hypocrisy, which is a little bit ironic because Jesus is just watching people do things and not, helping the widow, as Kay pointed out in our deep dive. But this hey, you people with lots of money who are giving basically pocket change for you. That's actually not the impressive thing. And it reminded me of 2 different West Wing episodes. The pilot episode is one of them where President Bartlett just takes down this particular conservative Christian group who's trying to attack in anti-Semitic ways, who's trying to attack his staff and imply that he's pro-choice and therefore pro-abortion, and they want him to do things that he's not willing to. It's a whole complicated thing. But he like, President Bartlett comes in at the end and is like, now listen here, your people sent this doll to my grandkid, and that is, or to my kid, and that is not okay. It's this whole thing. But the other West Wing episode that I really love where this happens is President Bartlett has like a gathering of radio journalists, and everybody's already in the room and like mingling and stuff, and some people are sitting down, some people are standing up before President Bartlett gets there. And then he like comes in and everybody stands up except for one white woman who doesn't get up out of her chair when he walks in the room, which is like proper etiquette for the president of the United States.
Yeah.
And he like goes to town on her and reads her the riot act, because she's also a conservative talk show host who has like a PhD in like literature.
English literature.
In English literature, but like the things she's saying are as if she had a PhD in theology or like other stuff, right? So she makes herself sound like more of an expert in a field that she's not an expert in. And so he reads her the riot act for the harm that she has caused and the hypocrisy of calling herself a doctor in the PhD sense because she's not using it appropriately on her radio show and all of that. And then is like, and when I walk into the room, everyone stands up. And then she like stands up and is all chagrined and stuff because she's called out on her hypocrisy and on her like horrible actions. It's one of my favorite moments, and I have a lot of favorite moments in West Wing. I might have to rewatch West Wing sometime.
It kind of sounds like it.
And then in verse 38 we read, as Jesus taught, he said, beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces. So this is a particular group of people who are like, yes, I like my position of power and I want everyone to like see me and be in awe. So I was just thinking about the folks from the Capitol in the Hunger Games, and literally like their clothing is super ostentatious, and it's especially like Effie Trinket, who comes to do the reaping in District 12, and her outfits are always like so counter to everything everyone in District 12 is wearing. But it's this like, yes, see me and be impressed with me and respect me for who I am. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then in the start of verse 40, Jesus is going on about these rich, powerful people and says, they devour widows' houses. I am almost certain that this is not in the sense of Hansel and Gretel.
You mean people didn't make their houses out of gingerbread?
I mean, I'm not here to destroy your life choices, although in that case, like, either add some structural support that's not gingerbread, and please don't eat it after it's been, like, you know, rained on.
I was going to say, and get something to protect it from the rain.
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure that this is a poetic language sort of thing. Just saying. Mm-hmm. And then also in verse 41, Jesus sat down opposite the treasury and watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums. See, now this is like Groundhog Day, which I have seen, because there's a bit where Bill Murray's character spends a few days very carefully watching the arrival of an armored truck so that he can steal a bag of money from it. And because the exact same things literally happen every day as long as he hasn't previously changed them. Mm-hmm. He decides, sure, why not? It's not like this day is going to, you know, not happen again anyway. So, but Bill Murray's character's intentions were a little different than Jesus was, because I'm assuming he's not there to steal from the treasury, because that would be not Jesus.
That'd be a little bad. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then in verse 43, we read, then Jesus called his disciples and said to them, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. We already talked about this, some of the difference that putting in a penny means for someone who it is their last penny versus someone who makes tons and tons of money. But it reminded me of the hobbits in both Lord of the Rings and Bilbo in The Hobbit, where their contribution was actually like some of the most pivotal contributions to the effort, but they were so dismissed so frequently as like, oh, they're just little hobbits, little halflings, little kid. Like, they're not kids, but they're treated like kids, which is its own problematic thing. But their contributions are just dismissed as like not important when it, and then finally at the end of Return of the King, Aragorn says, "You bow to no one," and then bows to them, and finally they get the like respect and honor for the contribution that they made. But yeah, mostly they just don't. Just that. Recognizing people for the work that they've done is important.
Yes. I also loved their reactions to that in the movie, because you don't really get the sense of their reactions in the book. But when Aragorn bows to them, and then literally everyone else does, in the movie, it's very clear that Frodo and Sam are kind of embarrassed. and and yeah, and Merry and Pippin are delighted.
Yeah,
so,
I love that too.
Fun.
Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss the nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the 25th Sunday after Pentecost. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Rohloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at NERDSATCHURCH, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our full guest episodes and interviews, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. We hope Patreon can help us get our episodes transcribed for those who need or prefer that. Though if you want to help us with transcripts, let us know via email or social media. As the ancient Christians said,
Pax vobiscum.